Hey, thanks for joining me again for our small group study in the book of Luke. Today I want to start with a question for you. Do you have someone in your life who is your go-to person? The person who you rely on when things get rough? The person who, when you get in a pickle, you get in a bind, you call them up? Is there a person who, when you just need to talk to somebody, you call them? Maybe it's your spouse, maybe it's your best friend, maybe it's your parent, I don't know. But is there someone in your life like that? Well, Jesus had some people in his life like that. He had several men that he went to when he needed a job done, when he needed something taken care of. And one of those men was Peter. And today we're going to see that on the night that Jesus was arrested, Peter had a low point. Peter had a time where he didn't do what needed to be done. You see, Jesus was in need of some support, and Peter wound up denying him. Now, who's Peter? Peter is one of those men that Jesus called from the shoreline of the Sea of Galilee and said, "Come, follow me. I'm going to make you a fisher of men." And Jesus guided Peter for a few years and taught Peter and helped Peter understand who he was as best that Peter could. And Peter told him just that night, the night that Jesus was arrested, Peter said, "I will follow you wherever you go. I'll do whatever needs to be done." And they went out to the garden, and Peter was one of those who was near to Jesus while he prayed and told God, "This is going to be a rough time, but I'm willing to do it." And Peter was there, and Peter was supposed to be praying, and he fell asleep, and Jesus came and said, "Pray that you don't fall into temptation." And then the guards came, and they came to arrest Jesus. And Peter is the one who drew his sword, and he was going to protect Jesus, and he went to kill a man, and then Jesus healed him and de-escalated the situation. And then the guards took Jesus, and they took him away. And see, now Peter has an option here. What can he do? Can he follow after Jesus and try and rescue him? Jesus had said, "Let's just go with this." But Peter's thinking, what do I need to do? But Peter, in the end, is going to wind up denying Jesus. He's going to wind up saying, "I don't know who Jesus is." You see, and we're going to see that denying Jesus leads to sorrow and grief. Look with me now at our text, and let's see what happens on that night where Jesus is arrested. Luke 22:54 through 55. They seized him, that's Jesus, led him away, and brought him into the high priest's house. Meanwhile, Peter was following at a distance. They lit a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat down together, and Peter sat among them. So what did Peter do? Well, he followed after Jesus. He went into the courtyard where these people who had arrested Jesus and were ridiculing him had lit a fire, and Peter sat down with them. He didn't run away. He ran after Jesus. You see, earlier I said that Peter had said, "I'll do whatever you need. I'll follow you to wherever." Look at these verses from just a few verses up. Verse 31, "Simon, Simon," Jesus is talking to him, "look out. Satan has asked to sift you like wheat, but I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. And you, when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers." "Lord," he told him, "I am ready to go with you to both prison and to death. I tell you, Peter, the rooster will not crow today until you deny 3 times that you know me." Peter had told him, "I'll follow you wherever you go." And that's what he did. He followed after Jesus, and he went to Caiaphas' house. And it appears that John was somehow intertwined with that world, and he was able to get Peter into Caiaphas' courtyard. And Peter's there with those people, and he is just trying to figure out what to do. Now, I want you to think for a second. Now you don't know this story. Imagine you're reading this for the first time. You're reading about Peter, and Peter has followed Jesus, and Peter has just said, "I'll do whatever needs to be done." He'd almost killed a man in defense of Jesus, and now Jesus has been arrested, and Peter has gone after him. He's snuck through the night, and he's got to this courtyard. Imagine you're reading this for the first time. I want you to take a moment and consider what you might be thinking about this man, Peter, at this point. Now you might be thinking about Peter that, man, here's the time. He's gonna do it. He's gonna finally fulfill what he said about Jesus. He's gonna follow him to the end. He's gonna do what it takes. He's gonna maybe break Jesus out of there, and he's gonna go forward. Well, that's not quite what happens. Let's look at this next set of verses. When a servant saw him sitting in the light, he looked closely at him. She said, "This man was with him too." But he denied it. "Woman, I don't know him." After a little while, someone else saw him and said, "You're one of them too." "Man, I'm not," Peter said. But an hour later, another kept insisting, "This man was certainly with him, since he is also a Galilean." But Peter said, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about." Now, we learn a lot about this scene from the other Gospels, so we're going to talk a little bit more about what's happening here. We want to look at each denial and say who accused him, what did they accuse him of, and how did he respond. Well, first off, we have this servant girl, the girl who probably led him in the door. You see, John had somehow gotten Peter into the courtyard. We don't know how it really happened, but John knew the folks somehow, and he got Peter in. This girl led him in, and so he's sitting by the fire, and she goes, "Hey, aren't you a follower of that Galilean? The one that's in there, the one they're questioning?" And Peter says, "No, I don't know what you're talking about." See, the language used here is he's dismissive of her. He's like, "Girl, you don't know anything. You don't know what's going on here." He dismisses her. Then another one, a little while later, comes to him and says, "Hey, aren't you one of them?" You see, at this point, Peter had moved away from the fire. He realized that they kind of knew who he was, and so he got in the shadows a little bit. One said, "Aren't you one of them? Aren't you part of that group that's following Jesus?" You see, this group is what they were kind of scared of. This group that might raise an insurrection. And so Peter says, "No, I don't know him." And one of the other Gospels says Peter took an oath. Maybe he invoked God's name and used that as to kind of bolster his argument that he didn't know Jesus. He wasn't a follower. He wasn't one of that group. And then later, another one comes to him. And this one is interesting. This one actually was in the garden when they arrested Jesus. This one actually is kin to the guy that Peter almost killed. And he kept insisting. Over and over he said, he's one of them. He follows Jesus. And this time Peter, he says, "Man, I'm not a follower of him." And he takes another oath and he throws in a cuss word here. Somebody wrote in a book that maybe Peter is trying to pretend like he's not a follower of Jesus by throwing this cuss word in there. I think Peter was stretched. I think Peter was under pressure, and Peter let the old Peter out. And the old Peter was one that might say that, might throw a cuss word in there. And so Peter does that. He's denied Jesus 3 times. First, he says that he denies knowing Christ. Then he denies any association with Christ. And then finally he claims that their accusations are ungrounded and unfounded. Peter's under a lot of pressure here. Do you ever feel like you're under pressure when those around you who don't follow Christ, those around you who ridicule Christ or ridicule the life that Christ calls you to? I want you to take a moment. I want you to prayerfully consider this question. How can you see Peter's fear reflected in some believers today? And what is the danger of being afraid of identifying with Christ? You see, it can be a challenge for us at work or at home or in the community to follow Christ, especially when those around you don't follow him or they ridicule him. Peter's under a lot of pressure. He said, "I'll follow Jesus anywhere." Jesus said, "Oh, Peter, you're gonna deny me." And then Peter does it. And Peter, he's at his wit's end. And let's see what happens next. Immediately while he was speaking, a rooster crowed. Then Jesus turned and looked at Peter. So Peter remembered the words of the Lord, how he had said to him, "Before the rooster crows today, you'll deny me 3 times." Then he went outside and wept bitterly. You see, earlier at the meal that they had, Jesus had told Peter, "Tonight it's going to happen. Before the rooster crows 3 times, you're going to deny me." And when it happens, Peter's like, "Oh, that just happened. That just happened. I did that. I don't know. I don't know what to do now." He says he leaves weeping bitterly. Weeping bitterly here, the language is weeping like someone you loved had just died. Peter is at his wit's end. And what I find fascinating is that Jesus turns and looks at him. Jesus isn't far away. Jesus isn't locked up in a cell somewhere at this point. Jesus is close enough to see Peter. And when Peter finally denies him for the 3rd time, Jesus turns and looks at him. And he sees him, makes eye contact with him. And Peter sees that, and Peter is devastated. But what I find interesting is that in the midst of all that Jesus is going through, he knows that Peter's right there struggling too. Man, that should be a word to us. When we struggle, Jesus, who holds the universe together, when we struggle and we're under pressure to deny him, he's got his eye on us. Not in the bad way. Not in the, let's watch this happen. It's in the, man, do it. Be careful. Be careful. Avoid that temptation. Jesus is watching out for us regardless. But Peter is devastated. Peter leaves there weeping bitterly, and he is at his wit's end. You see, in the coming days, Peter and the others, they see Jesus crucified. They hide out in a room, and they encounter Jesus some, and finally, they just say, let's just go back to fishing. We don't know what to do. And Peter's like, I'm useless. I've denied Jesus. I don't know what to do. So they go fishing. They go back to their old way of life. And they're up there one day in the sea fishing, and they ain't catching much. And all of a sudden, somebody yells from the shore, hey, cast your net on the other side. Peter's like, wait just a minute. I've heard that before. I know that voice. So Peter jumps in the water, swims to shore, and realizes this is Jesus. And he is so excited to see Jesus. Jesus is like, hey, what's up? Let's have a meal. Let's eat a little something. So they sit down by a fire, and they begin to talk. And Peter he's probably a little shy. I mean, he ran to Jesus, but he's probably like thinking, oh no, what's Jesus going to do now? Look with me in John chapter 21 for a second. When they had eaten breakfast, Jesus asked Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said to him. You know that I love you. Feed my lambs, he told him. A second time he asked him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Yes, Lord, he said to him. You know that I love you. Shepherd my sheep, he told him. He asked him a third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was grieved when he asked him the third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Feed my sheep, Jesus told him. Truly I tell you, when you were younger, you would tie your belt and walk wherever you wanted. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will tie you and carry you where you don't want to go. He said this to indicate by what kind of death Peter would glorify God. After saying this, he told him, follow me. In our life, there are going to be times when we are under pressure. Pressure from the world to deny Christ in word or deed. And sometimes we might fold. We might deny Jesus. We might deny Jesus' way of life. And we might think, well, I'm done. I can't do any more. That's where Peter was. Jesus had called Peter to be a fisher of men. Jesus had led Peter and taught Peter and groomed Peter to be a leader. And when Peter was under a bunch of pressure, after doing what no one else did, him and John, they alone followed Jesus. And after doing that, and he felt the pressure, and finally he denied Jesus. And he's like, well, I said I wouldn't do it, but here I am, and now I'm useless. Sometimes we feel useless to Jesus after we have denied him in word or deed. But Jesus knows that about Peter. He knows what Peter's feeling. So he goes specifically and talks to Peter and says, Peter, you don't have to live in that guilt and that shame anymore. He says, feed my sheep. He says, lead them, teach them, follow me. You see, we have a choice when we deny Jesus. We can wallow in that guilt and shame and just say, I can't do anything else, I'm done. Or we can go to Jesus, say, hey, I totally screwed up. I messed that one up, Jesus. But I want to follow you. I want to do what you've called me to do, groomed me to do, provide the Holy Spirit to me so I can do it. So I want to do that. Jesus says, good. Thank you. You're forgiven. Now, follow me. Feed my sheep. You see, no matter what in our life we do, we can always come to Jesus. And if we repent in humility, he'll bring us back in. He'll set us back on the track to the ministry and the calling he's given us. There might be people in your life who need to know about Jesus. There might be people in your life who don't quite realize that you're a follower of Jesus. I want to challenge you this week as you go out to consider this. What actions do you need to take to more readily be identified as a believer of Jesus? Who needs to know that you are a follower of Christ? You might be under a lot of pressure, a lot of strain from those around you. But what do you need to do to show people that you're a follower of Christ? Maybe it's love harder. Maybe it's care more. Maybe it's to more openly demonstrate that you live a life that is led by the Spirit. Whatever it may be, what do you need to do so that people will realize that you're a follower of Christ? And also, who in your life needs to know that? Somebody in your life needs to know that you're a follower of Christ and that you live differently and that you live the abundant life and that you can tell them about that. So today we saw Peter. He said, Jesus, I'll never deny you. I'll follow you anywhere. And then when the moment came, he defended Jesus in the garden. And then he followed Jesus when only him and John did so. But then he crumbled under the pressure. And then we saw Jesus reinstate him and say, Peter, it's fine. You're forgiven. Now move forward. That's what we saw today. Man, that can be a picture of us. That can be a picture of God's forgiveness in our life. Thanks for joining me this week. I look forward to seeing you next week as we start to finish out the book of Luke.